Howdy. My group is presenting the Fair Labor Standards Act, also known as FLSA. My name is Blake Goswine.
I'm Andrew Barth.
I'm Chris Thompson.
I'm Katie Mirasola.
So, a little description of the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the United States labor law that creates the right to a minimum wage and time and a half overtime pay for people who work over 40 hours. FLSA prohibits most employment of minors in oppressive child labor. FLSA applies to employees who are engaged in interstate commerce or in the production of goods for commerce, or who are employed by an enterprise engaged in commerce or in the production of goods for commerce. So a little development of the FLSA is on June 25th, 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed 121 bills. Among those was the landmark law in the nation's social and economic development, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Moving forward to 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed to amend the FLSA and to make it illegal to pay more or to pay people less or more based on their gender. In 1986, an amendment was used to provide special certificates to employers to allow them to pay employees less based on their abilities and age. Moving on more recently, May 25th, 2007, George Bush increased the minimum wage to $7.25, and then in 2016, we had a rule change. According to the rule and law passed by Barack Obama, employees making less than $913 a week must be paid overtime.
Moving on to the comparison, I found that the FMLA, or the Family and Medical Leave Act, was very similar. It guarantees certain employees up to 12 work weeks of unpaid leave each year with no threat of job loss, and it only applies to those who employ 50 or more employees for at least 20 work weeks during the year. Who is eligible for FMLA? The employee must work for a covered employee. The employee must work for a minimum of 12 months and at least 1,250 of those hours during those 12 months. The employees also must work at a location with at least 50 other employees. To be qualified for FMLA, the employee either has a serious medical condition, or they have to care for an immediate family member, a birth of a child, care of adopted or foster care child, a qualifying demand that arises from employee's spouse, child, or parent, or have a medically necessary therapy session. The next act we compared to the FLSA is the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act became a law in 1990. The ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The purpose of the law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. Title I, or employment, part of ADA allows for the same opportunities and benefits as everyone else. It applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and the employer must define their disability, establish guidelines for the accommodation, and address their medical exams. The Title II, or public services for state and local government, requires public places to make sure their services are accessible to individuals with disabilities. And lastly, the Title III, public accommodations and services operated by private entities, prohibits any public place from discriminating, and businesses must take steps to communicate effectively with customers who have vision, hearing, or speech disabilities.
Hey, so I'll be doing the application of FLSA. FLSA was inducted in 1980. There was an overtime set for people who were eligible for the FLSA benefits. It's a 40-hour overtime, and those people receive a time and a half if they're qualified within their business that they're working. And as well, the FLSA requires that there's no child labor and that the child labor laws are correct. and that no child is being worked over a certain hours. And then also FLSA instituted a minimum wage. So for the people who are eligible for that would be most commerce jobs, just typical jobs. People who aren't would be like waiters, waitresses who earn tip money, and other tip jobs would not be eligible in some cases for minimum wage. And then to have FLSA at your place of employment, your place of employment has to have at least $500,000 in revenue per year. And then also it has to be a non-tip job, usually, and then it has to be like some kind of commerce company that's trading assets and whatnot. As previously mentioned with application, there's tip rules that determine which way the FLSA is going to work at your place of employment. So you have to have $30 a month in tips minimum to be below the minimum wage required for the Fair Labor Standards Act. And like the minimum wage difference, I think is around $2, determining on what state you're in, because a lot of it is state driven. And then you have to include other people who are involved in the tip. So if you're a waitress, you have to include your bus boy or someone who's in that role with your tips and divide it. And then some other people who can avoid FLSA jurisdiction would be ministries. They're for whatever reason exempt from the whole FLSA act. And then some kind of like interesting part of FLSA is that a lot of employers are now utilizing salary versus non-salary, where they'll put typically hourly wage workers on salary to avoid overtime concerns. So they're not paying as much to their employees when they're working over. So they're getting more other employees for less money. And they recently changed the requirement for minimum salary to $23,000 to $46,000. That's just so employers are still having people who are making $23,000 or less in a year still be able to receive overtime and not be clarified as salary. So now it's $46,000 to be a salary employee, where you won't be making overtime if you're working over 40 hours.
So this scenario is from my life. When I was 13 years old, I wanted to be a caddy, so I had to get a worker's permit that I had to get signed by my middle school office and then go over to the district office and get that signed and then bring it to the employer, which then from there we talked about my wage and how I'd be paid and everything. But then we also started talking about hours. Now, hours was very difficult because I was still in school and I didn't have my license at the time or anything. All I had was my little pen speed. But they went over that I couldn't work more than 3 hours on a school day, including Fridays. It had to be no more than 8 hours on non-school days. But then total, it couldn't be no more than 18 hours during a week when school is in session, and it couldn't be more than 40 hours when school is out. It also had to be in between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., except when school's out, in between June 1st and Labor Day. Then it also went into, they just briefly went over the Department of Labor if they were shortcutting me or anything that happened, that the Department of Labor could come in and start going through, like, they could give me my fair pay and whatnot if they were shortcutting me, which they weren't.
So some of the recommendations that we would have for FLSA would maybe be, like I was talking about earlier, stricter rules about salary versus hourly workers, and then the overtime benefits with that, and just having a finer line between employers trying to take away overtime from employees that would benefit from having that overtime. And then maybe some other adaptations to the act would be minimum wage update, especially here in Wisconsin and federally. It's been $7.25 since 2007, and inflation has increased since then, and which makes that cost of living go up. So this could be beneficial for a lot of Americans. And then other than that, we found that the act has been continually being changed and updated throughout the years, and there's a lot of revision. So we thought that was a good thing, and they should continue to do that.
To wrap it all up, the FLSA again is a law that creates the right to minimum wage and time and a half overtime pay for people who work 40 plus hours. It is applicable to most businesses and organizations across the United States. It has also been in act since the 1930s, and it continues to change and evolve throughout its lifetime. And then here is our references. Thank you.